Manfred von Richthofen is remembered as one of the most notorious fighter pilots in history, and he was known as the Red Baron. He was said to have been the ace of aces during the First World War, after being credited with 80 air combat victories at a time when aircraft was not hugely reliable and influential. But he was a man who led a fighter wing, which became known as the Flying Circus because of the bright colours of the aircraft. In Germany, Richthofen was known as a national hero, and his enemies greatly respected him, but on the 21st of April 1918, near to Vaux-sur-Somme, the Red Baron was shot down and was killed. There has been a significant amount of debate regarding his death and what happened around it, but he was a man who is considered one of the best known fighter pilots in history. But what is the story of the death of the Red Baron? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Manfred von Richthofen was born on the 2nd of May 1892 in Breslau, and he came from a rather prosperous family. He would spend much of his early years hunting around the family estate, but he first saw action in the First World War as part of a cavalry regiment of the Prussian army, and he fought in Russia at the beginning of the conflict, and also served as a cavalry officer during the invasions of Belgium and France. As part of his service, he won the Iron Cross for courage under intense fire, but then this role began to become one in which he would transport supplies to the trenches. This is because the First World War was categorised by trench warfare, and it was a war of attrition in which combat was very static, and cavalry was not the most effective once the German army had dug in. Richthofen, because of this, wanted to see more action than simply delivering supplies, and he then joined the flying service, and he took his first solo flight on the 10th of October 1915, months after joining. But he was considered a very talented pilot, and he had a great and deadly shot, and he was a keen marksman and a hunter. He was a brilliant pilot, and by 1917 he had become one of the highest scoring fighter aces, with dozens of victories. He then was awarded heavily, and was given command of his own squadron of fighters, the Jagdstaffel 11, or the Flying Circus. His aircraft was painted red, and he became known as the Red Baron, and the pilots in this group were the leading fighter pilots of the day for Germany. His brother would also become part of the group, and he would be shot down by a British pilot, Captain Albert Ball. The Flying Circus was highly celebrated, and it was very successful under Manfred von Richthofen's leadership, and the Allies had so many aircraft shot down that in April 1917 they called it Bloody April. It was estimated that hundreds of aircraft were shot down by the Germans and hundreds of Allied pilots were killed. But there was at the time in the conflict a sense of respect between the different pilots. Many German pilots who were shot down and killed were honoured by their enemies, and some were even given a funeral. On the 6th of July 1917, Richthofen sustained a serious head wound in combat against the formation of fighters, or the number 20 squadron, and he got confused and suffered from partial blindness. His vision did come back, and he managed to get his aircraft out of a spin, and he then executed a false landing in a field in friendly lines. But the injury led to the Red Baron needing a number of bone splinters removed, and he would less than 3 weeks later, against doctor's orders, go back to service. His wound its fault had lasting damage, and he often in flight suffered from headaches and sickness, and some historians have believed that this injury was linked to his death. But despite this, he would write a book about his life, and he wrote, "I am in wretched spirits after every aerial combat. I believe the war is not, as the people at home imagine it, with a hurrah and a roar. It is very serious, very grim." But at this time in 1918 he became a legend, and following his injury he refused to accept a job on the ground, and said every poor fellow in the trenches must do his duty. However, around 11 a.m. on the 21st of April 1918, whilst he was flying over the Morlancourt Ridge near to the Somme River, the Red Baron was hit by a fatal wound. He was chasing a Sopwith Camel, which had been piloted by a Canadian inexperienced pilot of the Royal Air Force. He had just fired on the Red Baron's cousin, then the Red Baron flew to the rescue and fired on Wilfrid May, and he chased him across the Somme. But the Red Baron was spotted, and he briefly attacked another camel of Canadian Captain Arthur Roy Brown. Brown then had to dive steeply to get involved, and he then had to avoid hitting the ground. Richthofen did avoid the attack, and he then resumed the pursuit of May. But at this part of the chase, a single bullet struck the Red Baron, and it went through his chest and damaged his lungs and heart. It was such a fatal injury that the Red Baron would be killed within a minute that he was hit. He lost control of his aircraft, which stalled and then entered a steep dive, and it hit the ground in the field, on a hill, north of the village of Vaux-sur-Somme. This was defended by the Australian Imperial Force, and when it hit the ground, the plane bounced a number of times before it skidded to a stop. Many witnesses, when they reached the aircraft, noticed the Red Baron was dead, and his face had smashed into the butt of his machine gun, and it broke his jaw and his nose, and led to many cuts on his face. The No. 3 Squadron, Australian Flying Corps, then took control of his remains, and his aircraft was then taken to pieces by souvenir collectors. But the RAF credited Arthur Roy Brown with shooting down the Red Baron, but it's believed that he was actually hit by anti-aircraft fire from the ground. His post-mortem showed that the bullet had gone through his right underarm, and the brutality of the wound, that as soon as he was hit, he would have lost control of his aircraft. Many historians have suggested that the most likely person to have killed the Red Baron was Sergeant Cedric Popkin, who was an anti-aircraft machine gunner, and he was using a Vickers machine gun. He fired at the Red Baron's plane twice, and he was in a position to fire the fatal shot when the Red Baron passed him a second time. Other documentaries have suggested other gunners, but it was clear that the Red Baron was fully aware of the risks of ground fire. It's also believed that his decisions in his last flight were rather unsound, and were not like his usual behaviour in the air. The Red Baron, who was seen as a superb fighter even by his enemies, was given a full military funeral out of respect, and his body was buried in a cemetery near Amiens on the 22nd of April 1918. The men who carried his coffin were of course his enemies, and a salute was even fired for him. A wreath was laid for him which said, "To our gallant and worthy foe," but then later the Red Baron would be reinterred in a German military cemetery. However, his body was taken to Germany, and it was decided that his body should be buried at the Invalidenfriedhof cemetery in Berlin, with many other past German military heroes and leaders. He was given a state funeral, and when Hitler came into power, a huge memorial ceremony took place by the grave, and a memorial stone with one word, Richthofen, was erected. His body was then later moved to the Richthofen family grave plot in Wiesbaden. The Red Baron's legacy as one of the greatest fighter pilots in history has seen him become an iconic figure in German warfare. Along with the Flying Circus, they were a feared group of fighters who would not shy away from combat, but Richthofen would be shot down and killed, and he was credited with at least 80 victories over Allied pilots, which was a huge amount. The respect his enemies had for him was rather interesting, showing how gentlemanly warfare could be at the time of the First World War. But the Red Baron was an iconic pilot whose actions over the battlefields of the First World War deserve to be well known. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.